Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode for you all about setup and stance. It's something that's come up a few times recently with athletes asking on where their feet should be, how wide, how narrow, whether they've got too much toe out. So we thought we'd give you our thoughts on it. Before we get into it though, as always, a quick thank you to our show sponsors, thetrainingstimulus.com. Please check it out if you're interested in learning more about movement mechanics or having a muscle imbalance assessment. Wit-fitness.com. Use our discount code LL15 to get 15% off your Wit kit. And Hydro, our blood flow restriction partner, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your Hydro kit. So Rob,
Yes.
how are you doing?
Very good.
Good. Stance.
Yes.
How's your stance, mate?
My stance is all right. My stance is quite narrow, I think,
Okay.
compared to some, especially when you go to actually, both in my squats and my deadlifts, I'm quite a narrow person, which is obviously, well, we know why we're going to go into it in a bit. But for me, I've always found when I compare my, say, squat, being a low bar squatter, which is normally a bit more like hip dominant, people are normally quite wide, so they can really sit into the hips. Like thinking, if someone's not too sure, you think like a sumo deadlift, not as wide, but quite wide, sitting into the hips, so you can really get into those glutes and hamstrings. But for me, I quite prefer to be a little bit tighter through that position and kind of ask more of like the stretch reflex and more of my like ankles, my ankle dorsiflexion, my knee flexion. So like that sort of position. And same as my deadlift, I feel quite narrow in there, and a lot of people are quite wide, especially when they're coming from, I'd say, the commercial gym. Because you look at a
Yeah.
commercial gym, people doing deadlifts, they're normally feet are like pretty much right out by the knurling and their hands are outside there. So it's like they're in like a semi. It's a really interesting, really interesting stance. But what about yourself? Because your
Yeah.
bilateral stuff isn't, you don't do loads of bilateral work, do you?
No, I don't do tons of it. But when I would deadlift, I'd also be, I'd say, normal narrow in that my feet would be under my hips. And then when I squat, they'd be shoulder width, which is very wide. No. So the first topic we're going to talk about is width,
Yeah.
and we're going to break down setup and stance into three sections: width, toe direction, and whether one foot's forward or not. And these map nicely to the three planes of motion. So width would class as a frontal plane variable, and when we're going through this sort of stuff in the training stimulus mentorship, we talk about the 27 setups. And if you've ever done the 27 squat warm up, this maps very closely to that. And you can think of width as having three main options. You can have normal, wide, and narrow. And people always ask, like, what's the optimal width for a certain lift? And as always, it depends. Theoretically, and from a physics point of view, having your feet under your hips gives the most direct transfer of power in that everything's going straight vertically, which is where you want the bar to go. So you're not wasting any energy compared to being narrower than that, where you'd have some, if your feet were narrower than your hips, some force would be going outwards. And if your feet are wider than your hips, some force is going inwards as well as up. So it's less like in the world of physics, less efficient to be driving in that direction. So the question then becomes, why would you do that? Why might it be worth going wider than hip width? And the first one, as Rob alluded to earlier, is from a mobility point of view. By going wider, you're asking slightly less of certain muscle groups, namely the glutes and the lateral hips, like glute med as well, and TFL, ITB. So being slightly abducted in the hips means those muscles actually need to lengthen less as you descend into the movement, whether it's a squat or a deadlift. And because they need to lengthen less, you need to be less flexible in those muscle groups.
Yeah, I think something that's quite interesting here as well is it does also, because you mentioned, as always, it depends. And I think sometimes what's optimal isn't necessarily what's necessary for you. And it's like, so one of my clients, which I know you've dealt with as well, like he is programmed. So if he did a normal squat, he's completely comfortable doing a normal squat. So normal width, so probably around shoulder width, maybe slightly out. But because he has other weaknesses, he needs to be wider, so he gets more adductor, so more of a
Yeah.
sumo stance. So even though that might not be optimal for his top end barbell back squat, what that sumo or wider stance squat then does is help his mechanics in other movements beyond just the squat. So the weaknesses and the pains that he might be getting day to day actually then get improved because other muscles start working. So
Yeah.
it is that question of why are you, say, barbell back squatting or barbell deadlifting? Is it because you want to be a power lifter? If it's because for anything else, then you don't need to be so dogmatic about what the stance is or what the most optimal stance is, because the maximum load isn't necessarily always the overall arching goal.
Yeah, spot on. And yeah, there's a great caveat to have there in that, yeah, we need to get clear on exactly what the lift is for, what's the desired training stimulus. And if you're going wider, like people who naturally tend towards a wider stance might be tight through their glutes and lateral hips, so they don't like lengthening them. But equally, they might just be very strong and good at loading their adductors, like you just said there. The wider your feet go, the more the adductors will have to lengthen during the movement. So you're getting some clues about what people like and don't like. And if you're trying to improve their ability to load the adductors, then you can use the wide stance or the sumo variations to work on that. Like Rob says, even if it means you can't lift quite so much, there'll be some mechanical benefits. And while we're on the width point, it'd be useful to cover off a couple of common compensations. If somebody's too narrow or too wide, something you'll often see is that they fold forwards, either flex at the spine or at the hip, and the bar starts to go forwards of the feet. And the reason for that is kind of the same in both instances, whether you're wide or you're narrow, in that because you're lacking mobility in whichever relevant muscle group, you're trying to feel like you're getting depth. So you're trying to lower the bar somehow and generally leaning into the sagittal plane. So you're pushing your butt backwards, trying to load hamstrings, glutes, and lower back to feel like the bar is going lower, even if the hips are not actually
Yeah,
going lower in space.
it's
And that's a
pretending to
very
have
common.
room. So you're like, okay, I've got
Exactly.
I've got room here. Like, no, you haven't. You just literally folded forward more. And it's
Yeah,
like, and
exactly.
then you have to start weighing up the implications that that's going to have later down the line, is especially when you do start loading up movements and you start taking that load in places where it shouldn't necessarily be in that movement. Then you have to
Hmm.
say, okay, maybe it's something I need to start addressing. And I think as well, when you, it's be curious to know what you say here, but narrow stance is definitely something I don't really see often. It's nearly
Yeah.
always too wide or going wider and then still folding forward, just because. And I know from experience myself, that's just day-to-day life for most people. Sitting down in a poor position, they lack hip mobility anyway, so they're opening up their hips to try and give themselves a little bit more room, and they still don't have the room anyway. So then, because they do then the folding option to think that they're going there. And I, from personal experience, is always making sure that you're looking at the bar path, as you alluded to in that bit
Mm,
there. What is the best position you feel comfortable in where that bar travels as straight as possible? Because
exactly. Yeah.
that is the efficiency part, not the size of the width or anything. Is, can that bar stay in the straight line or as close to the straight line needed to perform maximally?
Yeah, yeah, that's really important. And we've done deep dives on the squat and the deadlift where we talk about bar path more if you're interested in that. So they're worth checking out. Um, but the other thing to say on the width, and this came up when I was assessing a weightlifter this week, asking like what width should they pull versus catch in, and obviously the catch needs to be your squat width. So whether it's an overhead squat or a front squat for the snatch or the clean, respectively. But pulling is generally a narrower stance, and that goes back to that power transfer point in that if your feet are closer to under your hips, you're able to generate a more direct transfer of force into the bar before then going wider to give you the mobility and comfort to get as low as possible to catch the bar. So we're trading off against the different needs of the different components of the Olympic lifts there. And the pull, we want maximum power. We don't need so much mobility. Whereas in the catch, we need a little bit more mobility. So potentially um, less direct transfer of force, but it's going to be your best squat position, which is going to let you stand the bar up from as deep as possible.
Yeah, and what I also find interesting here is recently I've been introducing more weightlifting into my training, and I generally have relatively good mobility for squats, deadlifts, and whenever I do these, I've never had any issue. Well, not say never. At the moment, I don't have any issue in these positions. Yet as soon as I wear Converses, as soon as I then wear Converses to do weightlifting, that speed that I need
Mm,
dorsiflexion, that speed that I need knee flexion, and hip and all that sort of positioning. Because I don't naturally have great mobility under speed. Wearing lifters made a big difference because then I was able to stabilize through the lifters more and then get that extra dorsiflexion, which means I can get a better bottom position. And it's funny because looking at my squat is a very mobile squat compared to most, say, powerlifters. And when you look at a
yeah.
powerlifter squat, I get really low, I have no issues, and I'm wearing flat shoes. But then you put myself then into a weightlifting exercise, say like a clean or a snatch,
Mm,
and that demand is then so much higher that actually weightlifting shoes help me, even though I don't have an issue normally. So
yeah.
sometimes you have to assess again that bar path, that watching how the movement's going on, because different styles of training require different styles of flexion, extension,
Yeah.
and stuff.
That's a really cool point. Yeah, I think that ties into something we talk about a lot here is the specificity in that Rob's mobility is movement specific. So his dorsiflexion in a squat is better than his dorsiflexion in a clean because his body feels safer with less speed and a dynamic threat to the
Yeah,
body.
that's exactly.
Whereas in the clean, because it's so much faster, his muscles tighten up to protect him, which means he can actually access slightly less dorsiflexion. So we know, like in terms of pure mobility, he's not lacking at all. But in terms of context specific mobility, it isn't as good as it is in the squat, which is a really cool point.
Yeah, so I guess that leads into our second one with toe direction as well, because
Mm-hmm.
this is something else which I feel you can really see someone's tightness when they do weightlifting for how they land. And you
Yeah,
can see, because it's they don't have a chance to say with a squat, you can set your feet to what you think is correct and kind of force yourself. And yet, even in the squat, you see a lot of time people's feet's kind of screwing outwards to where they want to be and then staying there for the remainder of the reps. But with weightlifting, because it's so fast, your
yeah,
feet just land where they want to land. And then that gives you a very good telltale of how immobile or mobile you are.
exactly. Like I think it because it's so fast, you don't get a chance to
To cheat.
override, yeah, what your body naturally wants to do. So
Yeah.
it's a great assessment tool to see somebody clean or snatch and see where their feet end up because they can't consciously override where their body naturally wants them to be. And like you say there, a lot of people are a lot more externally rotated. So the toe direction in terms of rotation is a transverse plane issue. And the things that you typically see is that people toe out to varying degrees depending on how comfortable they are. And we know anatomically, toes dead ahead will actually load the glutes in the transverse plane more and sooner because your hip is more in a more internally rotated position. So that theoretically could be optimal, but the reality is very different from that because a lot of people are a bit tight in that direction of loading the glutes. So they need to toe out to experience the lengthening of that muscle. And this is something we talk about a lot in the mentorship where it's not so much about the position of a joint, it's about the motion of a joint. So your toes starting way out, they're in an externally rotated position. But as you descend through the squat or the deadlift, they experience some internal rotation. So they're internally rotating, even though they never achieve actual internal rotation. So the hip is never turned inwards. But as you descend, you get some internal rotation, which means you get some lengthening and loading of those glutes in the transverse plane, which is so important for your performance. If you don't get that, you're not recruiting the biggest, strongest muscle in the body, so you're much less likely to complete the rep. So your body has this intrinsic ability to know where it needs to be to get something out of those muscles, even if your mobility isn't perfect. So again, you'll see this in weightlifting that people tend to pull with toes a little bit more pointed forwards and tend to catch with toes a little bit more turned out because the mobility demand is higher in the catch. But their body knows that it can get a little bit more power, toes dead ahead, jumping into the bar if the mobility demand is a little bit lower.
So, what is something that someone can do if they find themselves, say, weightlifting and landing with toes out a lot more often? Like, is it something they should force themselves to try and obviously rectify and try and be a little bit less toey out, or is that not too bad?
It's not too bad in short. In like, if I had to give you a short answer, the reality is it depends. It depends how much they're towed out. It depends what else is going on at the ankle and the knee. If it's like a really excessive, like, I'd class excessive as 45 degrees or more turned out. Anything that's sort of 20, 30 degrees of turn out is pretty normal. But once you start going beyond that, that leaves some clues to suggest that there's probably something going on either in the foot and the ankle itself. The foot's not able to pronate very much, or the hip isn't able to internally rotate very much. So you'd need to look at those areas as a starting point to see, is there something really missing here? Because ultimately, if you are able to do your weightlifting with a slightly more toe ahead than 45 degrees, you're probably going to experience an uplift in power because you're getting better muscle recruitment. So yeah, hopefully that answers your
Yeah,
question.
no, the reason why I say this is because, again, from personal experience and seeing myself lift, when I lift in Converse weightlifting,
Mm.
how I land in my squat, my clean or my snatch is about, say, 45 degrees on external rotation compared to wearing weightlifters where I'm not anywhere near as much. And that's just because, again, my body knows, okay, you're wearing these shoes, I haven't got as much dorsiflexion, so
Yeah,
you're going to struggle, so I'm going to have to turn you out more to give you
yeah,
that ability to access that range. And it's just, I wanted to hear you say that, but it's a really interesting thing to, when you do watch back your videos, which you should be doing, as we say often, look back at your stuff and look at comparisons compared to lifters, barefoot, like all these different things, and see what happens along the way. Because they,
yeah.
as we've been alluding to in here, there are telltale signs for potentially other things that might be not necessarily working to its best ability, but also give you an idea of, do you need lifters? Do you
Mm.
need flats? Do you, like, what kind of shoes should you be wearing? And sometimes if it's something you don't prioritize, like say ankle dorsiflexion. So in your squat, if you don't prioritize movement mechanics that are going to help improve dorsiflexion, you should get yourself a pair of lifters, because
Mm.
then you're going to have that dorsiflexion essentially given to you, hit better depth, and probably be able to feel more stable in the movement. So they're kind of like a cheater's way of getting it, but that will bite you in the ass later on down the line anyway, because you're essentially hiding this problem and saying, right, I'll deal with that later. It will
Mm.
always come out because you'll get stronger, and then another issue will come along. You'll end up working your way back. So this is all from personal experience, so I'm giving you that
Yeah,
heads up now.
yeah. That's a really cool example there that you can toe out less when you wear lifters because the dorsiflexion demand on the ankle is less with the heel elevated, and yeah, that's kind of tells you one of the main reasons why people toe out is because they're missing dorsiflexion, and having that external rotation means you can achieve relative dorsiflexion more easily. Really cool.
So, lastly, 1 foot forward. Now, this
Mm.
one I find really interesting because we talk often about that symmetrical like stance and like probably what's going to be most optimal. But as we know, none of us are symmetrical. Otherwise, we'd look incredibly weird anyway. But some people have longer legs, some people have longer arms, some people are just tighter on one side compared to the other. So when 1 foot forward happens, what is that a telltale sign normally of?
So it could be a few things, like you say, a leg length discrepancy could lead to 1 foot forwards. The principle behind understanding any of these stance um,
Variations.
abnormalities, variations, that's a better word, thank you. Understanding stance variations is, what is that stance doing for your body? Like, why does your body do that? What does that stance give it that it's not getting in a perfect toes ahead, like normal width stance, even footed? And if 1 foot is forwards, the body feels like that is the optimal position to stand up or lift whatever weight you're asking it to lift. So could that be because one ankle is tighter? So generally the forward foot might have a tighter ankle, so it needs less dorsiflexion because it's a little bit further forwards. Is it because there's some knee pain, so you're asking less knee flexion from the forward foot side? Or is it because there's a rotation in the hips, so you're driving 1 foot forwards to counterbalance that to neutralize a rotation. So all of these are possible reasons, and you need to look at your videos closely to see which one it might be, or do some digging, like assess the dorsiflexion, compare your ankles, assess your knees. Like, can you get into just the same level of deep knee bend on one side versus the other, or do you trigger some pain? Look at your hips, like force yourself into even stance. Like when I'm doing assessments for somebody who's having squat issues, I'll always put them into shoulder width with toes dead ahead, barefoot, and ask them to squat. And that's basically a magnifying glass for seeing any variations in their squat mechanics. So if they've got a shift, if they've got a rotation, it will show up more clearly because you're not letting the feet compensate for it. And I think the big question behind these is it a problem?
Yeah.
And the short answer is quite often not. Most people are asymmetrical, are one-handed animals. We always have a preference for using one side more than another. So it's a bit unreasonable to expect us to be perfectly symmetrical. In a perfect world, that would be lovely if there was 50% contribution from each side and each side had exactly the same strength, mobility, and stability. But in reality, that's never the case. So if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. But like Rob said earlier, if you layer on loads of weight and loads of training volume, you can exacerbate the asymmetry, and eventually it might lead to some problems. So the key thing to do is keep on top of it, keep monitoring it. So if you're aware of it, just check in on it from time to time to see if it's staying the same or if it's getting worse. If it's getting worse, then you might want to get ahead of it and try to neutralize it out. So whatever that missing movement quality is, how can you reintroduce it to the body? So if it's just a simple leg strength imbalance, how can you teach the other leg to take a little bit more weight, a little bit more responsibility? If it's a mobility difference, how can you mobilize the tight size so that it learns to use a better range of motion, which is more even to the other one? And by staying on top of it and getting ahead of it, you're much less likely to experience a performance plateau and obviously an injury as well.
So, what would you suggest, however, if this isn't a mobility or stability issue and this is an actual limb length issue? Because I have a client who, when she deadlifts, she actually has one leg that is slightly longer than the other. Now, she hasn't had any issues really, but things are starting to show up. So the hips starting to play up a little bit, the shoulders starting to play up a little bit, and it's all like a coincidence. So we've worked a lot of unilateral stuff to make sure that one leg isn't that leg isn't always not working, for instance. But would this asymmetry be an issue if the whole life has always been worked with slightly one leg more than the other?
Possibly. So for leg length discrepancies, you can have an actual structural leg length discrepancy, which basically you need to lie down, have your legs pulled so that they're even and your pelvis is even, and measure the length of the bones. That's actually a lot rarer than people think. Like people who have leg length discrepancies think that their bones are literally different lengths, when the other type of leg length discrepancy is a functional leg length discrepancy, which essentially means their pelvis is tilted or shifted to one side. So it looks like one hip is higher with both feet on the ground. But actually, if you move their pelvis into a better position, their legs would be an even length. So the first thing is just to establish whether it's a structural or functional leg length discrepancy. And if it's a structural leg length discrepancy, then you probably want to do something structural to balance it out. Otherwise, there will always be an asymmetrical loading to the legs and the hips. So this is one of the few situations where I would actually consider using some sort of heel lift or block to square up the pelvis so that their hips experience more even loading through bilateral movements. Because unless the hips are level, you're always going to have one side do more work than the other. So it'll get even stronger over time, which will mean that the body wants to use it even more and more and more. So in those situations, yeah, potentially some sort of heel lift to square off the hips. But if it's a functional leg length discrepancy, then try and understand why the pelvis naturally sits where it sits. Can we work on mobility, stability, or introduce the right movement quality? So are they unable to move their pelvis right in space? And that's why they always sit into the left hip. And it was why the left hip looks higher than the right. If that's the case, then addressing their mechanics to say, right, I'm going to teach the hips to be over here, and then we'll do some training to ingrain that and build strength in that, so that when they come back to the bilateral movements, they've got a better chance of loading the hips more symmetrically.
Beautifully said, mate. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring that one up is because I had a discussion with someone else, something very similar to this, and I was basically saying to them that you try not to think of the deadlift as the only thing you can do for the hinge. And like the reason, like you saying about the block underneath the foot, now that looks different. All right. So in their mind, a deadlift with a block on the foot isn't a deadlift. It's a 1 foot on block deadlift. It's like, no, that's your deadlift. And
Yeah.
what I think is really important, and we've alluded to kind of throughout this whole episode, is that, you know, it always depends on what you're training for. If you're training for a powerlifting competition, then you can't have a foot on a block. You can't do that because you have to have both feet on the floor, and you just got to do what you got to do. But then you have to understand that the implications of anything that's going to come down the line are due to your chosen sport that you're lifting in, whether it's weightlifting or powerlifting. But if you're doing training for the love of training or for the way of to get better, then things have to be more personalized to you individually. And doing a deadlift with your foot on a block, or doing a staggered deadlift because you're trying to say dominate more one side compared to the other side, or all these other variations. This is why variations, and we've discussed in length in episodes like our accessory episodes and stuff like that, this is why there is so much, because we all do need tailored stuff to some degree. It's just it only becomes a problem when it becomes a problem. And then you think, okay, now I actually need the tailored stuff. So you can do the generic deadlift, pull-ups and squat, all this stuff. But then when you start to get pains in the shoulder or pains in the hip, actually I need to do, offset pull-ups, offset push-ups, offset squats, offset, all that's why there's these offset variations, because we have these weaknesses in the body and variations that need to target different things. So it's definitely something to take into consideration, is why are you doing the lift and why are you so married to the lift if you don't want to go too far away from it.
Yeah, well said. I think it's a recurring theme through all our podcasts. We always say it, but getting very clear on what you're setting up for. So, when you're choosing your stance, what are you optimizing for? Are you optimizing for maximum kilos on the bar, or are you optimizing for a specific stimulus? So, like Rob's client earlier, he would go wider than is natural to him because the stimulus is to teach his body to use his adductors more and better. So he's made a conscious decision there to give him a variation that helps his body improve in a different way other than pure strength in the regular lift. And the irony is that his regular lift will benefit as a result, because he comes back to it with better functioning adductors. The main lift will benefit. And if you are optimizing for maximum kilos on the bar, maximum performance, then it's pretty easy. Just whatever feels best, your body will naturally gravitate towards what's most comfortable, and you'll know what lifts the most weight because it's probably the one that you've done naturally forever. But if you are trying to figure out what your movement limiter is, play around with your stance. So using those 27 setups, all the different width variations, all the different rotations through the toes and 1 foot forwards. There's 27 different ways to slice and dice that, and your body will feel which one is most and least comfortable, which will give you some clues as to what you might need to work on to improve your comfort in your regular stance. And I think just closing thought is basically, if you're in the middle and you're not sure how much you should be playing around with it, like Rob alluded to with the accessories episodes, the easiest way to build some of this stuff is in your warm-ups and in your accessories. So you've exposed your body to all these different variations. Your joints, your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments all get a flavor for what it's like to move in a slightly different way, which ultimately is going to make you more robust for doing your main lifting in your regular stance and open up some space and comfort, increase your comfort zone around that main lift.
Yeah, I definitely think I love that point, because I feel it's very easy to get bogged down in, okay, I need to improve my squat, so the accessories are going to be squat specific, so they're going to be exactly what my squat looks like. And it's like, Just like essentially with my deadlift that I'm trying to work on at the moment, where I'm having a bit more round back deadlift in my accessories of it, because I'm challenging my positions, I'm challenging weaknesses, I'm doing different things outside of the main lift. But in the main lift, I'm doing it how I want to perform the main lift at a competition, because that's where it's key. But yeah, really like that point. So guys, we really hope you enjoyed today's episode. I thoroughly enjoyed discussing this because it's a really common question that I've had, and even from a coach's perspective, when you're looking at clients and you can see certain things, you ain't got to tell them this shit. You ain't got to say, oh, you look at that squat, your toes are that far out. But that can be a telltale sign for you. So, maybe I need to address something. Because if they're squatting like that normally and I haven't coached them to do that, that's giving you a very good indication of what's going on. Just like what Ash said about getting people to squat with feet straight in a conventional stance, because it magnifying glass on what's going on. So definitely start looking at stances, widths, and all this stuff, and take some mental notes, even off your own training. And if you want some ideas or you want some thoughts on this, send us your videos, and we'd love to review them and kind of give you some thoughts as well. So we do hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, thank you very much for your time. If you'd love to leave us a review, we would love that very much. You can head over to all the usual platforms wherever you listen to the podcast or watching us. But for now, we'll see you next week, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.